Hi, I'm Josh Nightingale, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Aveiro in Portugal. And today I'm talking about how we can use network analysis methods to understand patterns of bird movements around estuaries and how we can apply those methods to understanding the impacts of development. So in this talk, I will quickly talk about connectivity and conservation and the connections between the two. I'm going to briefly explain network analysis because I expect not everybody is enormously familiar with it. Then I'm going to introduce you to the Tagus Estuary, where I live, and the species that I study, the Black-tailed Godwits. And then finally, we're going to look at assessing some impacts of development in this system. So, biodiversity targets and not meeting them has been in the news a lot this year. I think one of the key focuses going forwards is going to be on connectivity. It was one of the CBD targets before. The IUCN's recently released a big report on the importance of conserving connectivity between protected areas. And it's also a method that scientists use to assess and plan, indeed, protected areas. So what is a network? Very simply, a network is a collection of objects, and at least some of them are connected to each other. So an example of a network might be a transportation network where, for example, we have a bunch of metro stations in Lisbon that are connected together, in this case by tracks. And in network speak, we call the things that are connected to each other nodes, and you can have several different kinds of node in a network, and those are connected by edges. And edges can also have different properties, for example, their weight. Okay, so we can use network analysis methods to study properties of nodes. A couple of the most commonly used ones are degree and centrality. So degree, not this kind of degree, is very simple. It's simply the number of nodes to which each node is connected. So in this example network, the one in the middle has got a degree of 4, it's connected to 4 other sites. These ones on the right have a degree of 2 because they're each connected to 2, and these ones over here would have a degree of 1. The other method that we can use, centrality, is maybe a little bit more difficult to explain. I'm going to need some help. Thanks. So centrality is basically how much the node functions as a bridge between different parts of the network. So to give an example, the way we calculate this is by simulating every possible movement through the network, like so. And then of all of those possible journeys, you assess the proportion that passes through each node. So in this case, the node in the middle has obviously got the highest centrality values. And again, the 2 on the right have intermediate values, 2 on the left, the lowest. So to give a more familiar example again, we think back to this transportation network, the nodes with the highest centrality would be central interchange stations like this. If you've ever tried to get across Lisbon, you're always going through these stations. So that's proof of concept. The other kinds of network analysis statistics that we can get are properties of the entire network as an ensemble. And these include methods like edge density, which is just the number of potential connections that we actually observe. The diameter, which is basically the distance from one side of the network to the other. And transitivity, which effectively it's a measure of redundancy. It's to do with how many of each groups of 3 are connected to each other. Okay, something a bit prettier. The Black-tailed Godwit, this is the focal species of my PhD. Looks like this when it's breeding. It's a bit plainer during the winter. And this is a bird that migrates. So the population that I work with breeds in Iceland in the summer. And then during the winter, it migrates and spends the winter anywhere on the western coast of Europe, pretty much. And this species has been kind of a model organism for studying migration for a long time. In particular, just with these colored plastic rings. Since 1993, people have been putting unique combinations of plastic colors on individual birds, so they can then be followed throughout the rest of their lives, which can be 20 or 30 years. And so this ringing is happening in Iceland, including with chicks, but also happening at several wintering sites all over the coast in the UK and France and Portugal. And down here in the Tagus Estuary, where I'm based in Portugal, ringing has been taking place since 2010. And overall, as part of this big international collaborative project, about 3,000 individuals have been ringed and followed through their lives and across their migrations. The other nice thing is this is quite a big bird. They're quite visible, so bird watchers will often see these and report the sightings. And some people get quite addicted to seeing where in Europe these birds have been seen. And this has meant that just this very simple technology has generated about 50,000 records where we know which individual it is, where it was, and the date, which is a pretty impressive data set, I think, spanning nearly 3 decades. Now, one of the amazing things with Blacktoe Godwits is, despite being able to fly these huge distances over oceans, they actually don't kind of explore a lot. This is some work my supervisors did, looking at following birds throughout their lifetimes and seeing how many sites they accumulate over time. And so if you look, first of all, at countries on this plot, even if you follow birds for 25 years, they're generally only recorded in 2 or 3 countries. And similarly, looking at regions like North France or South UK, birds, again, are only recorded in maybe 3 throughout their whole lives. They don't keep exploring and finding new places. They find one place that's good enough, and they just keep going back there. So early on in my PhD, I thought I would replicate this analysis at a more local scale. So dividing up the Tagus Estuary into different recording areas, different roosting sites, different feeding areas. And again, we see exactly the same kind of pattern, even at this very, very local scale. You know, some of these sites you can literally see from one to the other. And even then, there's birds that have been followed since this project started here in 2010, and they've only ever been recorded at 4 or 5 sites on average. So these birds are incredibly site faithful, despite their ability to fly long distances. So this leads us to the question of how development can impact this population, right? Because if development targets one of these areas that birds are very faithful to, there's not much evidence that suggests they're going to go somewhere else. So the first thing I wanted to do was to build up a network of sites used by Godwits in the Tagus Estuary. Not a social network, but a Godwit network. So for those that don't know the Tagus, Lisbon is on the northwest bank, and there's a huge estuary here. And all these dots represent different sites. The kind of brownish color is feeding areas that are only exposed at low tide. And these sort of greeny blue sites are on land where the birds roost at high tide. And you can see they're spread out all across the estuary. So the first thing that I did was simply to draw a line between each pair of sites if a single individual was recorded using both of those sites. And I built this up by going through each individual and adding all of their movements, those sort of 4 or 5 sites that each individual uses during their lives. So thicker lines on this plot represent more common movements, and thinner lines are movements that only 1 or 2 individuals are recorded doing. And you can see that some very distant sites are actually quite strongly connected, and some that are much closer to each other don't have so many individuals moving between them, which I think is quite interesting and something I'd like to look into a bit more. But for today, I'm going to focus very specifically on the question of how development might impact this network. So the development in question, this is a planned international airport to expand the capacity of Lisbon's existing airport. And the site preferred by the Portuguese government, in their infinite wisdom, is right here on a peninsula in the middle of the estuary, and also right next to a SPA, which is a European protected area. So here's a figure that I've adapted from the environmental impact assessment. Again, the airport is here. And And this simply shows the distribution of noise disturbance from planes taking off and landing over the estuary. And what we can see at these, the 3 projected noise levels, the intertidal, which is feeding habitat in the protected area, is strongly affected by up to 65 decibels of noise. What does this mean? Well, there's a study cited in the environmental impact assessments saying that 20% of the SPA intertidal will be affected by noise over 65 decibels. And the study they cite says that at 65 decibels, about half of birds change their behavior, a quarter of them become alert and stick their heads up, and about 10% of them will fly away. At the lowest level of noise they disturbed, that they projected, only about 3% of birds actually responded. So we have these kinds of brackets. Just to say, this study used an air horn. Right. So the first thing I simply looked at was what properties do these sites have that are affected. So while this isn't exactly statistically significant, you can at least see that the sites that are affected, where it says true, have higher degree than the sites that are not affected. So the sites that are affected are amongst the more connected in this network. And the same pattern with centrality. These are the sites that operate as hubs for this population when they're moving around the estuary. So the next question I asked is what happens to this network if birds avoid noisy sites? So looking at removing all the sites affected by noise over 65 decibels or over 55 decibels from the network. And you can see, especially at 55 decibels, a lot of the sites in the middle of the estuary go missing if birds avoid them because of the frequent disturbance. And this has an effect on the integrity of the entire network. So we can see that edge density, which is the proportion of possible connections that are observed, decreases with each scenario, but a much stronger effect if we consider 55 decibels, which was that threshold at which birds sort of stop responding. A similar kind of thing with transitivity, and we also see this pattern with diameter. So the opposite sides of the network effectively get further apart in terms of their geodesic distances if we remove the sites affected by noise disturbance. And finally, so the environmental impact assessment says that 20% of the SPA area is going to be affected by noise. How does this relate to individuals? So firstly, just looking at where birds are all year round, we see about a third of them are affected by the higher noise level and 45% by the lower noise level, because of the way that they move in and out of the area of disturbance. But interesting, if we break it down seasonally, during early winter, the birds are more concentrated in the western part of the estuary. And at that time of year, a really considerable proportion of them will be affected by disturbance. In the later winter, they spread out and some of them use rice fields and things adjacent to the estuary. But obviously you need to survive the early winter to make it to less winter. So the effects of disturbing most of the population at a critical time of the year obviously has been underestimated by this rather simple area-based approach. So to conclude, individuals move, and understanding how they move is the key to understanding impacts on those populations. To do that in this study, we just used some old school tracking technology, just plastic colorings. And crucially, we then used network analysis, which I think is a really great tool for studying the connections between sites. You can consider the network as a whole, or you can focus on individual components and how they fit into the bigger picture. And finally, I think it's worth taking this platform just to draw attention to the pressing conservation threat of this planned airport in the Tagus Estuary. And with that, I would just like to thank my wonderful supervisors. I'd like to thank the FCT for funding my PhD. And I'd like to thank everyone who listened to this talk. Thank you very much.